it is my pleasure. Oh, yes. So I have to ask everybody. We are recording the session, so you're aware that a recording is going on, and everything that you say, you ask, or you write is being recorded. Okay. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to Professor Bernd Meyer. Professor Meyer is a professor of intercultural communication and cultural studies at the University of Mainz. And he is an expert on interaction, particularly on interaction mediated by interpreters. And he was the first one, I think, to collect the data and look into interactions mediated by so-called ad hoc interpreters, who are family members or friends of foreign residents who need access to healthcare services. And what was fascinating in his studies was that he found positive aspects of this, not only the drawbacks of working with, let's say, non-trained interpreters or non-professional interpreters. Together with Thomas Schmidt, he published the first corpus of interpreter-mediated data, and for a while now he has explored quantitative research, so the use of corpora and concordances to analyze this type of data, interpreter-mediated data. And he has recently, I read some work of his recently, and I think this work has developed a lot and is really interesting and fascinating. And I think it is going to be your topic today, is it, Bernd? Okay, you needed to open your microphone. Okay, I close mine.
Yeah, sorry, that's the usual mistakes. Yeah, it's thank you for the introduction. It's funny that you mentioned that I found some positive aspects in ad hoc interpreting, because I was very often criticized for that by people from the interpreting or translation professions, actually, because they found that somehow that this would have a negative effect on their professional performance, professional options to get jobs, etc. But I think it's not my job as a scientist to care about that. It's not my problem, actually. And the other reason is that it's simply the reality in German hospitals still today. I mean, 20 years later, it is a matter of fact that most translation, written or spoken, is done by non-trained people. So it's employees, it's family members. There's something normal to it in German institutional settings, actually, even in schools or everywhere. And so, yeah, I mean, we have to deal with reality. We cannot do something else. So we have to research that, even if we don't like it. Yeah, even if there's something negative about it. And there are also a lot of negative aspects about ad hoc interpreting, of course. But even if we don't like it, we have to study it, and we have to study it in a way that is not biased by preconcepts or wishful thinking or something like that. Yeah, that's my my way of going for it. And yeah, it's interesting that this aspect is yeah, it's something that's still part of my work, that people don't like it to talk about the positive aspects of ad hoc interpreting. Okay, I will share my slides. I hope it works. You never know. And you never know. Yeah, I did the same. I made a, no, that's not what I want. I made a test beforehand, and now the drive is not appearing on my screen. Why not? What's going on? I did it with another Zoom account. I'm quickly reorganizing the slides. Where are they? Why don't they appear? sorry. It's really bad.
What's the matter? You're not allowed to, or it doesn't work?
No, I have it on the OneDrive, the Microsoft OneDrive, and and it doesn't appear in my Zoom. So in the other account it appears, but here it doesn't appear, and I don't know why. If anybody has an idea, so I can access the iCloud drive. I can access websites, photos. Maybe I can. No, not as a photo. That's not good. Shit. Is it not possible? Just one moment, okay?
Okay.
Sorry, it's
okay.
it's stupid, but it's
sometimes
sometimes it is like this. So I have to do this. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Let's try. Yeah. It's coming. Okay. Can you see it? Yeah, something.
Yeah.
Okay, the first slide is not working, but I hope that the others are working. Well, yeah, it looks relatively good. Okay, maybe some things are damaged, but I think we can start with it. Why is it not a presentation? So I don't have it as a. It seems to be only a PDF. What is?
That's right. Yes, it looks like a PDF. Yeah, right.
Yeah. It shouldn't be like that, but we can work with it maybe. It's strange. You know, you have all these applications and all these servers, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work. Okay, so my talk today will be about the possibility of quantifying qualitative analyses, and I will talk about it and taking a corpus of interpreter-mediated communication as an example for this, because I think it's in conversation analysis, discourse analysis. So all studies and all approaches that deal with spoken language and that deal with the analysis of talk, we usually have qualitative approaches, approaches that deal with linguistic aspects of communication, or even with non-verbal communication on the basis of single examples, of single cases, and quantification is somehow something that is not, that is not practiced, that is not what people normally do. And I think there is actually a gap in the methodology, because very often people say something like this or that phenomenon. These phenomena are frequent, or they say they are rare, or something like that. So they use notions that refer to quantities, but they do not really explicitly say what is frequent or what is rare. Yeah, so the frequencies play a role, especially when it comes to statements about what is normal, what is unusual, etc. But we are not good with frequencies and quantities. Before I start, I would like to make some statements about translation. Translation is maybe a phenomenon that is not not an area of study for everybody. Actually, translating is producing analogous effects by different means. That's a very brief statement about translation, analogous effects by different means. And if you look at the second stage from a transcript, a physician instructing an ad hoc interpreter before the beginning of a consultation, just say what I am saying. You know, that's the naive concept of translation, the naive concept that thinks the translator or the interpreter only repeats what the original speaker has said, which is usually not true. It's actually usually not possible to do that, because if you would do it, you would simply echo the statement of the other person, and that's not what you are supposed to do. So what you are supposed to do is you have to create an analogous effect, but with different means. The different means are very important, because they are the different means of the other language. And so you usually have a gap between the original version and the translated version. Yeah? And that's something that many people are not aware of. So many people somehow refer to the identity between the original and the translated version. For example, interpreter associations very often say, oh, we are faithful interpreters. We never add anything. We always stick to the original version, which is in practice, if you look at the actual performance, which is not true, but the self-concept is we are not doing it. We are not adding something. Yeah? And of course, it's also the expectation of the users of interpreting services. Very often the users want that. They want interpreters to not add anything, not change the message, etc., etc. But nevertheless, if you look at the data, you always have the gap. And the gap is what I'm going to talk about, actually. And that is the role of non-renditions in interpreter-mediated interaction, and the reasons for the distribution of non-renditions within a corpus of interpreter-mediated interaction. And non-renditions are contributions of interpreters that are not based on previous talk of other participants. So they might reflect in some ways the contributions of others, but they are born out of an intention that comes from the interpreter himself or herself. Like, for example, if you explain a concept, if you give a hint to someone like, oh, I think the person hasn't understood very well what you're saying, something like that, you know, that's a non-rendition. That's not translation. That is something that comes out of the interpreter role and the function of the interpreter to keep the interaction going. Okay. So before I start, I would like to give kind of outline of my paper. So first we have a kind of corpus description. Then I will talk about non-renditions in different contexts. And then I will talk about the non-renditions in the corpus that I have created together with Philipp Angermeyer and Thomas Schmidt. Philipp Angermeyer from Canada, from York University. And in this corpus, we have the possibility to look at the directionality of translation, whether it goes from language A to B or from language B to A, which sometimes makes a difference. And then the relationship between non-renditions and language choice. Because different from what many people think, very often people have a choice between different languages in the interpreted scenario. So they are not using only one language, but rather different languages. Okay. Now the data sources for our corpus, the corpus is actually a kind of composition of different subcorpora. So we have data from court proceedings from New York, where many languages are involved, many different languages. Language pairs like Spanish English, Russian English, Haitian Creole and English, Polish and English. So that's somehow mirroring the social linguistic situation in New York. Then we have the corpus from Germany, interpreter-mediated doctor-patient communication in hospitals with Portuguese and German and Turkish and German, which is not representative for the social linguistic situation in Germany, but it's only like examples. And then we have a smallish corpus with simulated interpreter doctor-patient communication from a training seminar. So that's a different kind of data. And we put that all together in one corpus in order to be able to make comparisons, okay? So that's one intention that we had. So we created an international corpus of interpreting data from a variety of settings with a large number of language constellations. We standardized the annotations for this multilingual data. We integrated different transcription conventions and digital formats into a common framework. And yeah, we organized web access and sustainable data curation. Sustainability is yeah, a difficult word in this context, because if something exists for 10 years in digital format, then it's already sustainable. But if you think of a book that exists for 1,000 years, for example, then that's a different kind of sustainability. So yeah, sustainable, I'm not sure whether it is really sustainable, you know, but let's hope that it will exist in 1,000 years. You never know. Okay, we have a small group of registered users, and I don't think that's really a problem, because it's a very focused area, very small group of researchers worldwide that are interested in that kind of data. So it's not like the other corpora of written texts that you have, where you have thousands and you know, maybe millions of users who look up for words, for certain spellings, etc. That's not the case with this corpus. But nevertheless, certain things are valid for this corpus as well, like, for example, the accessibility from all over the world, or the different digital formats that can be accessed, like PDF or XML files. Okay, let's look at the data a bit. On this slide, you see how we annotated the utterances of different participants. We annotated, with regard to the interpreters, we annotated whether the utterance from the interpreter is a rendition or not. So in this case, for example, maybe you can no, it's not possible to make it to enlarge it. Do I have anything? I can do something like a spotlight. So here you see the spotlight. Here you have an utterance of the interpreter. The interpreter is an interpreter for Haitian Creole. So he speaks a Creole language. It's a court proceeding. And we have an English utterance beforehand by the arbitrator. The arbitrator is here. The arbitrator says all decisions made by an arbitrator will be final, made by an arbitrator. And then we have the rendition. All decisions that the arbitrator makes are final. And maybe you notice the gap. An arbitrator and the arbitrator. That's only a very small difference, but of course it's a difference. Nevertheless, we decided that this is a translation or a rendition of what the arbitrator says. So it's not that that we are very strict about the notion of rendition. Even if there is a gap between original and translation, then it's nevertheless a rendition because it is based on what the arbitrator says, and it clearly mirrors what the arbitrator wanted to make clear. In this case, that he is deciding and that the decision is final and that nobody can go to court afterwards again. Okay, then we have non-renditions and also non-source utterances. And this is from the hospital data. Here we have a discussion between a patient, an older Turkish man, and his son, who is the interpreter, and they are discussing about the blood sugar values of the father. So the father has claimed that the blood sugar value is about 200, and then he said, no, 360. Let's hear. Can we spotlight? That's what we want. 360, which is very high. Okay, that's a very high blood sugar value. Very bad situation. And then the son says, you said above 200, Dad. So is it 360 or is it 200? They are discussing about what is the right value, what is the value that they should pass on to the doctor. So in this case, I would say, yeah, that's what, for example, Laura and Claudio have called reflexive coordination, but it's not a rendition. Okay, this will not be rendered to the doctor. This is a discussion between the son and the father, and therefore we decided that this utterance 360 is a non-source utterance. It is not treated as a source for later translation, and the utterance of the son as well is a non-rendition because it's a dispute with his father, and it's not something that is rendered to the doctor or from the doctor. Okay. Now, these are only examples, of course. We have cases of non-renditions. So non-renditions cover a wide range of different linguistic activities. We have the notion of coordination and the need for coordination in every interpreter-mediated event, and coordination can take different forms. It can be explicit, of course, but it can also be implicit. It can be reflexive in the sense that people try to steer the conversation in a certain way, but it can also be small things like hearer signals, for example, what Laura Gavioli has written about, because the interpreter is the first person that gets the message, and this usually triggers some kind of listener behavior, like saying something like oh yeah, all right, etc. So that's also contribution. That's a kind of important part of conversations, response tokens, but it is definitely not a rendition. Then we have other cases like question-answer sequences between interpreter and primary participants, as we have seen in the example with the father and the son, and discussing the blood sugar values. And then we have, other kinds of linguistic activities, like, for example, warnings during a court session that has been research by Marta Arumi and Mireia Vargas Urpi from Barcelona. They studied court proceedings, and they discovered actually that the interpreters sometimes warn defendants or testimonies. They warn them to say this or that, or don't do this, don't do that, which is something that you would not expect in court, but actually it happens. And so they decided to distinguish between justified and unjustified non-renditions. And the unjustified non-renditions are those that really work against the overall purpose of the event. Of course, from the criminal point of view, I would say it's a justified non-rendition. I want this information, but depends, of course. I mean, the moment you get into normative statements about interpreting, you have to make clear what your standpoint is. And then we have non-rendition actually in contexts where affective stance comes in, where people talk about emotions, or where when they show emotions, and that's also an interesting point, that emotions trigger non-renditions in a way. Okay, so non-renditions necessarily occur in dialogue interpreting. They are not specific for ad hoc interpreting. It's not a sign of lack of professional stance, for example. And non-renditions are, as such, are not context bound, but contextual factors play a role, as we will see later. Okay, now the non-renditions in our corpus. Here we have a table with a lot of numbers, and I highlighted some of these numbers just to show you that there is a high share of non-renditions in some of the subcorpora, but not in all of them. So here, for example, you see the data from the natural data from hospitals, authentic interpreter-mediated communication in hospitals, and the share of non-renditions is actually more than 60%. So more than 60% of the utterance of the interpreter are non-renditions. And in the court proceedings from New York, it's only 8%. Yeah, so there are some non-renditions, but not many. In the training session, we have a lower share of non-renditions, although the participants are ad hoc interpreters, nurses from a hospital. They are lay persons. But actually the setting obviously triggers that they behave different from what they do when they are interpreting in real life situations. Okay, so the lay interpreters in the medical setting have a share of more than 60%, and there's also a large share of non-source talk. So non-source utterances from the primary participants, like the doctor and the patient. 82% of their utterances are non-source. So they are directed, to the interpreter, or directed to the patient directly in German, or the other way around, from the patient directly to the doctor in German, which is also interesting. And then we have a completely different picture in the court, in the arbitration hearings, and a slightly different picture in the training context. Now, if we look at directionality, we may see that there are also some differences between the two or the three corpora, actually. So we have the translation status in comparison or in relation to the to the language choice, which simply means that renditions, we have more renditions made in the minority language, which means that the direction of translation goes from the institutional agent to the layperson, to the client, the patient, or the claimant, or whatever. So it's not that non-renditions and renditions are equally distributed to both sides of the language barrier, but rather we have more renditions into the minority language and less renditions from the minority language to the institutional language, which is in this case English or German. Okay, so renditions represent a higher share of utterances made in the minority language, than of utterances made in the official language. Non-renditions are not equally distributed to both sides of the language barrier. Non-renditions are produced when addressing the doctor or the arbitrator, not the claimant or the patient. So the more frequent case is that a patient speaks in German to a doctor and not the other way around. So the doctor uses the interpreter more intensively and the patient makes less use of the interpreter and sometimes starts talking to the doctor in German directly without using the interpreter. Now, the same with language choice. Here we also have huge differences between the corpora. If you look, for example, at this value, the share of lay participants' utterances in the minority language that are treated as sources, that are meant to be translated, is 18% in the hospital, and it is almost 80% in court. So if someone says something in the minority language, then it is treated as something that needs to be translated automatically in the court setting, but not in the hospital setting, okay? And yeah, the training setting is, again, a bit odd one out. It's between the two, okay? So it's more than in the authentic hospital communication, but less than in court. One could say, or one could summarize this table by saying that if you have more official language, then you have less renditions, which is logical in a way. People don't need the interpreter all the time. Some aspects of the conversation, it is possible to speak, to switch to same language talk. And we have huge differences between the contexts. The institutional contexts are not equal. So clients speak official languages. That's one point that I would like to make, because I highlight that point because I think it's really the normal case in many migrant contexts. Yeah, whenever migrants are present, they usually speak some of the institutional language, and it's, yeah, I would say it's an exception if people don't speak the official language at all. Yeah, that also occurs, but it's not the normal case. And then, yeah, the share of utterances of lay participants in the institutional language is sometimes more than 30%. There is a high share of utterances in the institutional language, and if this share is high, then it lowers the share of renditions. Yeah? The rate at which minority languages is translated differs between institutional contexts: 18% in hospital, 80% in court. Okay, I'm coming to my conclusions. Non-renditions are ubiquitous in dialogue interpreting. That's something that we already knew, but I think it's important to highlight that because of these normative expectations and normative attitudes towards translation that still exist. Contextual factors such as institutional norms or linguistic resources of lay participants influence the occurrence of non-renditions. One could say the more clients or the more people switch to same language talk, the more the interpreters feel somehow empowered to perform as normal, ordinary participants. So they feel empowered to make statements, ask questions, etc. Not in the role of interpreters, but in the role of whatever, people who are simply present in the conversation, and that somehow people that somehow participate in one way or the other. Non-renditions in our corpus are mostly in the institutional language, and that's something that is different, and that is not what we expected. We started with the assumption that non-renditions would occur more on the minority language side of the language barrier. Okay. The more participants treat interaction as same language talk, as I already said, the more non-renditions are produced. And if you do a qualitative reanalysis of data, you can show that interpreters are really getting involved as primary parties, and that they started to perform or to assume different roles in interaction. And yeah, that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Thank
and
you.
I hope,
thank you, Bernd.
And I hope it worked with these slides. Actually, it weren't the slides that I wanted to show. So I also have this problem as well. So it's really a mess from my point of view, but I hope it is not a mess from your point of view.
From my point of view, they were rather clear and visible, and so I hope that I mean, I could follow what you said on the basis of what I could see. So I think it worked.
Okay, thank you.
That is my impression. Any comments, questions? I don't know, considerations, thoughts?
I don't know if you hear me, because
yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, fine. Now I was just thinking of this this data that non-renditions are more frequent in the institutional language. I was wondering if this depends on the type of migrants, let's say, or people, because I've seen that you have Turkish or probably several of these participants have a long have been staying for a long time in Germany. Is this for maybe the reason? Because I was thinking of some of our data, for instance, Arabic women who are coming in the last months of their pregnancy through rejoining their partners, and they just arrive to the healthcare services without having any type of understanding or any type of possibility to speak the institutional language. Or Chinese people who have been living for a long time in our area, in Reggio Emilia, for instance, and they are completely separated from the local people, so they basically don't speak any Italian. So I was wondering if there are very different contexts also in this type of situations. I mean,
yeah, of course. I totally agree that this what this observation is not something that you can generalize to all migrant settings. But in many cases, if you are frozen, okay, so nothing is going on. Can you hear me? I cannot hear you.
No, we missed you.
We had that in the morning as well.
Yeah. I stopped listening to you from when you said it's not generalizable or something like that. That was the last word I could hear.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Coming back. We had that this morning as well, the same phenomenon, that all of a sudden the connection is away, it's gone, and it comes back. So we simply trust on that. Okay, what I was trying to say is that the phenomena that I've described are not, that cannot be generalized. It's clearly dependent on what kind of individuals you have in the corpus, and there are always groups that are so segregated that they cannot speak the official language, and that and of course these individuals have to rely completely on the interpreter. They are completely depending on the interpreter. But I would say at least for Germany, I would say that the established migrant groups like Turkish or Russian speaking, or even the Arabic group that came here mostly 5 years ago, they are very often able to talk German to a certain extent. Okay, it's not that they are fluent or whatever. They need an interpreter, but sometimes people prefer to say something in German when they think that they are able to express themselves, and they make use of this. And what I found interesting is that they make use of it even in court. So even in a very normative setting, people all of a sudden start speaking English. And Philipp Angermeyer wrote a paper about it with a funny statement of a arbitrator who says, if you need an interpreter, then be interpreted. So stop talking English, yeah? Don't talk English. So it was like creating a monolingual situation, although everybody is multilingual, yeah? And instead of having a kind of flexible use of language resources, the arbitrator insists on translation. Yeah? Okay. But in the medical setting, for example, very often it's not that normative. There's nobody regulating the language use, and then people make choices, and all of a sudden they start talking German. Now, what we expected was that they would that the non-renditions would occur more on the other side, and it was interesting to see that from a quantitative perspective, it is more non-rendition talk on the institutional side, like the interpreter talking to the doctor, for example. We thought there might be this peer relation between the interpreter and the patient, and then they talk about certain things like, what do you think about this doctor? Do you think it's a good doctor? Blah, blah, blah. No, which is possible to do it in Turkish, for example, without the doctor noticing it. Now, it was the other way around, and yeah, that's what we found interesting. And in our qualitative reanalysis, we also found some reasons for that. But of course, it's not generalizable. It's something that is specific to this data set. And in other data sets, you may find other things, of course.
Any other comments or? Okay, I have a couple of questions myself. I liked this category of non-source language or contributions. I like it for two reasons. The first is that you can actually compare the percentages with, see how much non-source contributions there are, and comparing them to non-renditions, for instance, or to renditions. I mean, it's a category that I find very useful. So the questions are two. The first is, are you actually attributed non-source? I mean, I understood that it's monolingual talk, direct talk, for instance, when the patient speaks German. But I think there's something else too. And second, if you did any comparison, if you calculated any comparison between or among this percentage of non-source text and other categories like non-rendition or or rendition.
No, we didn't make this comparison. Actually, the category is a bit more difficult than the category rendition, non-rendition. So the distinction between rendition and non-rendition is relatively easy, but the source is the non-source is something that you only know afterwards. So if you look back in the conversation from the if you look at the translations and then you look back and say, oh, is this yeah, how does this relate to what the client, for example, has said before? And for example, in this conversation between the son and the father about the blood sugar values, there might be some information that later will be translated, like it's 200 or it's 360. So the number, for example, might be translated later to or passed on to the doctor. But nevertheless, the dispute about what is the correct number, that's something that is not translated to the doctor. So nobody says we have a dispute about the blood sugar values and we are discussing whether it is this or that. So, and that's why we thought this is non-source talk. This is talk among participants without the intention to make it a rendition later on.
Okay, so non-source includes everything that doesn't get translated, even right?
And yeah, exactly. And so everything that doesn't get translated, but it might be that it's also a conversation between the patient and the doctor. So it could also be, for example, talk in German between the primary participants. That could also be non-source talk, because they simply don't make use of the interpreter.
Yeah. And you didn't do any comparisons, or you didn't see any relationship yet?
Yeah. The point is, of course, one could make a comparison in the way if there is more non-source talk, then there is less renditions, probably. Of course, logic. It's a logic thing. Maybe we could do a quantification about how often does it occur, or who is doing the non-source talk. For example, is it more on the patient side, or is it more on the side of the institutional agent? That would be an interesting comparison, because I could imagine that maybe even the doctors, for example, in the hospital settings, do a lot of non-source talk, like site sequences with the interpreter, like talking about something else that is not linked to the specific setting, whatever. So there might be non-source talk, not only on the minority language side, but also on the institutional side.
Yeah. Anyone?
Yes, I have another question about this interesting aspect of talking the same, sharing the institutional talk. I was wondering if you have looked at the consequences that this has for interpreting. I mean, for instance, very recently, I have seen a conversation in which the sharing, the attempt to talk the same language between the patient and the healthcare provider created many problems in the way in which the interpreter, in our case, the mediator, was able to understand when doing a rendition, when not doing it. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you have looked at this aspect.
No, we haven't. In this, I mean, at the moment, we haven't looked at this particular aspect. But in in earlier studies, I did so in relation to the use of same language talk and what happens with the interpreter in this occasion. We looked at it a bit when we observed that the interpreter feels free to do something else when the others are talking in the same language with each other, then the interpreter is somehow superfluous. He or she is not needed anymore, but still there in the situation. And then sometimes people start commenting on, you should do this. Or, for example, in the arbitration hearing, there's one case where we have a lot of relatively large amount of non-renditions. And that is because during the meeting, the participants discovered that the case is not adequate for this particular hearing. So it's not possible to make any legal, it's not possible to proceed with the legal issues. So they all of a sudden they discovered that before going to the arbitrator, the claimant has to do something else. And then they talked with him about what he can do to whatever, get his money back. I don't know what the case was exactly, but it was all of a sudden the whole group of participants was informing the client about, now first you go there and then you go there and then blah, blah, blah. And then the interpreter has an idea how to do it, how to solve the problem, etc. And then, yeah, the interpreting is over, it's finished. They all speak English and they are providing information, and it's a very informal setting all of a sudden, because the formal part is over. It's not possible anymore, because they all of a sudden discovered, oh, you are in the wrong place in a way, yeah. and then, of course, the interpreter starts doing something else or remains silent. It's also possible, of course. But for example, a professional interpreter maybe would remain silent and would say, okay, my job is over, I'm done. But someone who's more engaged on an informal basis may feel free to, provide extra information, share experiences, give comments to certain things. And I would say that's somehow normal. That's what we all would do if we discover that we know something that is helpful for others. Yeah. So it somehow opens the floor for other formats of participation. But of course, it is difficult for the interpreter to come back to the interpreting role. If once you open the floor for other types of participation, then it's difficult to re-establish the interpreting mode. And I think, for example, in a training context, I would suggest that it's a problematic situation, and that I would not allow people to do a lot of same language talk, because that makes it difficult for me as an interpreter to find my role. Yeah.
Or maybe students are trained to get back to interpreting mode. I mean, because it's difficult. I mean, it's something that they might need some training about. I mean, just now get back after a dyadic sequence, a long dyadic sequence, or get back after. I mean, exercise.
Yeah, I would say that's also a kind of explicit. It's a kind of explicit coordination in a way to say, now we have to go back to the interpreting mode, or now do you want me to interpret this, or do you think that it's okay when I simply remain silent? That's something that you can negotiate explicitly with the participants, and that's a capacity or a competence that interpreters in migrant settings should have to negotiate their participation status.
Right.
And of course, it's not part of the official interpreter training in Germersheim. I mean, nobody would say, oh yeah, we have to train that, because the traditional view of translators and interpreters is usually that you have a language barrier and everything gets translated. And no dynamics, nothing.
Right, yes. There's a language barrier and it must be maintained.
Yeah, exactly. If you need an interpreter, then be interpreted. So the creation of monolingualism is somehow also a goal of professional interpreter or translator associations. They want monolingual clients. If the clients are multilingual, then it's a problem for them, because then you don't need a translator, maybe. Yeah? Maybe they can make do without an interpreter. Okay, not our problem, but it's funny sometimes with these professional associations.
Any other comments? Bernd said that he didn't want to go on with the monologue for a lot of time. So
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Especially not with this internet connection. Sometimes on, sometimes off.
Yeah. No, but it's okay on the whole.
I actually have a question, but which is an embarrassing question for me at the beginning, because I'm not sure whether I've understood some of the figures well, and then it might lead to a very naive question. So, but
maybe embarrassing for me.
So, you mentioned an 18.3% when you showed us your last figure. You know, the last table with the figures that you showed us. There was an 18.3% of share of minority language that gets translated into institutional language. Is that right?
Wait, I go back to that. There was in the medical setting.
Yeah, in the medical setting.
In the hospital setting, there was a share of 18% of lay participants' utterances that are treated as sources, 18%.
So does that mean that basically only the 18.3% of what the institutional user says in their own language gets translated into the institutional language? So the question is, yeah, so I guess that this implies that there is a lot of conversation in the non-institutional language going on between the user and the mediator, or sorry, interpreter in this case. In other words, I know, yeah, tell me, sorry.
No, it also means that there is a lot of same language.
Okay, yeah.
Which talk between the patient and the doctor. So because that's also part of their, so it's all of their utterances, 18% of their utterances are treated as translatable utterances that need to be translated. It also means that they have a lot of utterances like hearer signals, for example. They are simply listening. They are not talking a lot. So their contributions are not very extensive. They only say, and this also counts. So if you look at the numbers only, you may get a wrong impression. That's also a very important methodological point, that the numbers itself don't tell you anything. They only give you a hint, like there is something interesting, look at it in detail. And then you have to go to the qualitative part again and look in detail. Why is this, for example, why is this different from the others in the corpus? Yeah, sometimes we have the odd one out cases in the hospital. For example, we have one nurse that is really acting like a professional interpreter. She's very like no non-renditions. She's very, maintaining a kind of professional stance. I'm the interpreter, etc. And of course, the talk in which she participates is different from all the others. It has different quantities of non-renditions, less non-renditions, and that in itself it doesn't say anything. You have to find out why is that so? What is happening in this conversation? Why is this interpreter different from the others? And if you analyze their utterances, and you can see, okay, it's simply that she is avoiding to have side sequences with the doctor, or avoiding to explain something to the patient or something like that. She's very much like, I'm the interpreter and I don't add anything. Yeah, but that's an odd one out, and it doesn't make sense to take only the numbers for the analysis. The numbers is like, yeah, it's like a sign in the landscape. There is something. Maybe we should do an archaeological investigation in this situation, okay, with this little mountain or something. It's a sign, but it's not the explanation.
Yeah,
the
okay.
explanation comes from the, yeah, sorry.
So basically what I got from your answer at the beginning is that back channeling gets, of course, counted as well, but it becomes like white noise, basically. I mean, it cannot be counted as non-source, it cannot be counted as source. So it basically just creates an amount of users' participation that just simply is not in the figures, basically.
Yeah. It's that's I mean, that's also a difficulty of the counting. What counts as a non-source utterance? What counts as a source utterance? I mean, if you have these binary distinctions, then it might be that you don't get the gray zones between the two poles. Yeah, sometimes you may have things that are not this and not that, and yeah, somehow you simply decide, okay, I put it in this basket, or I put it in the other basket. Yeah, that's the limit of a quantification, I would say, because you need categories, and if you quantify, you need distinguishable categories, and sometimes things are not very well distinguishable. You know, it's difficult, or
Yeah.
maybe you need a third category or something like that, but you also want to keep it simple, because the annotation system, if it's too complex, then nobody can work with it. So you need a very simplified annotation system. Like part of speech tagging, for example, that's very, very simple. Is it a noun or a verb? A noun or a verb? You know, that's relatively simple. But if you go into the details, and if you start thinking about whether this particular language really has the category of verb, maybe, you know, because there are languages that don't have verbs, they do it in another way, then it becomes tricky, yeah? And then you are in trouble with your quantification.
Thank you.
Bernd, I was wondering, have you ever tried or have you found anything interesting with lexical concordancing, like, I mean, more traditional concordancing with this corpus of conversation? Have you ever found that? Because I mean, one of my first initial problems with interrogating corpora of spoken language is that you miss the sequence, basically, the sequence of speakers. And so if you generate a concordance, then you don't have a real textual context. I was wondering if you did anything like that, or you found anything interesting with this.
Well, it would have been possible, because the feature is in the X-Maralda system, so you can make something like keyword in context. So you have you can search for words, and then it gives you a context in which the word appears, and this might also be an interesting investigation for some things, for some technical words, for example, or for things like formulaic sequences, formulaic expressions. But we didn't do it, so I haven't used it. So, but it's in principle, it's possible to create, for example, word lists, and then search for contexts in which these words appear in the corpus. But I would say it makes more sense for a subcorpus of conversations that are from one domain and not from different domains, because usually except, for example, the nouns or the technical language is very, very different from, it varies from context.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm. Anyone else?
Well, if there's no other questions, perhaps I can add one, or at least just ask you to go back to an issue that you've already explored. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit more on what you think the contribution of quantifying is, because you've pointed to the problem.
Mhm.
That sometimes the fact that quantifying forces you into seeing problems would also be seen as an advantage. I wonder if you'd like to
Mhm.
say more about
Yeah,
your
what
experience.
I would say quantifying maybe offers you insights that if you only look at single cases, you will not get that. So you simply don't see it. For example, in our case, if you look at single cases, you will not find out that there are more non-renditions in the institutional language. Because it simply doesn't appear to you that this is a pattern. Yeah, the pattern can be visible only if you take if you have the numbers. That's, I would say, one advantage. And the other advantage of quantification is that that's something that I mentioned at the beginning. I came across with quantification when I was in this research center, and there were people working in quantitative approach. They really had statistics, etc., for language acquisition and how many whatever verbs and nouns have been used by children at which age. So they were like, yeah, experts of quantification. And once we had a discussion, and I said something like, "This is normal," or "This is something that happens all the time," and they said, "What does it mean, normal, all over? What is it? This is a vague formulation. Give us a number. We want a number." Because sometimes you think that this is frequent, and then if you start counting it, all of a sudden it appears that it's not that frequent, or that it's not statistically relevant, etc., etc. And I said, yeah, but my data is not enough for doing that. It's only a small set of data. If you cannot do statistics on that, it's only 10 or 20 conversations. What can you do with that? And they said, yeah, but nevertheless, if you say many, then you have to say how many. Okay, and I found that somehow convincing. If you can count it, then count it. You have to give a number, because the notion, or the formulation that you say it's many cases or most of the cases is really not that's not convincing. That's not not, I would say. But I actually, in the context of digital humanity, I would say that the more important aspect is not the quantification. Quantification is one option that you have when you work with digital data. It's easier to quantify, but of course you can also do it with pen and paper. It's also possible. Simply counting it in the old-fashioned way. It simply takes longer. But the real contribution of digital data is that you have more accessibility, possibilities of reuse. Other people can use the data as well for other purposes. And you have, via the accessibility, you have the possibility of reanalysis. So other researchers can reanalyze easily your data, can get access to it, can say, no, your analysis is wrong. I come to a completely different conclusion, which is also an interesting aspect, I would say, and a kind of advantage in science, that others can criticize my analysis, and that my analysis is transparent to others, or the databases of my analysis. So I would say that's what digital humanities contributes to discourse analysis. It's not the quantification. That's more when you work with texts, when you really have large amounts of data, and then you have patterns over time over the years, when does a lexical item appear the first time, etc. That's a different kind of research. But for spoken language corpora, it's really that it's very often difficult to get this data, and once you have it, then it's simply nice to share it with others, for example. And that's what digital data gives you the opportunity. It's much easier to do that.
May I, you know, Bernd, because we discussed it some times ago, that I'm not a fan of this type of quantitative analysis of mediated interaction. Well, my point is that it's about what you said before about distinctions and categorizations. I mean, categorizing this type of analysis, for instance, in your case, non-renditions and renditions, you lose the idea of the connections in the same interaction, in the same event, of different types of contributions and the ways in which they are included in a frame that is important to understand what is happening. So I have always thought that quantitative analyses are not able to do so. Do you have some new answer about this that you have recently developed?
You want me to convince you? No, it's not possible. I cannot convince you of the advantages of quantification. No, well, no, I see the limits and I see the criticism. I totally agree to your criticism, actually. So if you start quantifying it, you need to categorize the data. You have to put everything into a basket, and then the connection between the items and the connections between the utterances and the whole, the more general picture gets lost in a way, or at least that's a danger. But nevertheless, I would say that it's that the quantification also allows you some insights. I mean, it also offers you views that you cannot have when you are in the data. When you go away a bit and look from far away on the data and on the numbers, you don't see the details and you don't see all the connections, but you see the more global structures maybe, and that's also interesting. That's also something that contributes to our knowledge about what's going on in interpreter-mediated interactions. And so I wouldn't say that it's a contradiction. It's not either quantification or qualitative analysis. I would say both are interesting, and I'm definitely on your side that qualitative analysis gives you more insights. It allows you to understand what is really going on among the participants. That's what the quantification doesn't tell you. Yeah, it doesn't tell you why people are doing this or that and how people differ. And so, like something like intentions or something like the details and the dynamics of conversations, that is something that is not mirrored in the numbers, but the numbers give you something like the global picture of the interaction. And I would say it's also interesting. It's not a contradiction, I would say. But I respect your view. I mean, I respect everybody who says, no, I prefer the qualitative.
I respect your view.
No, because very often in social sciences, especially in social sciences, you have this very strong divide between qualitative and quantitative approaches who are really, it's like a war between them. I know that from Germany. It's like, you're part of this group or that group. That's a global, and then you have many subgroups, but the first distinction is quantification or qualification or qualitative analysis. And yeah, I think it's a bit, it's like a long war that has to come to an end. You know, people are tired of this war. Or I am tired of this war because I somehow understand that it's that both approaches have really advantages.
I agree with you entirely.
You should talk with the sociologists who are working with quantitative data. They don't like at all.
I don't talk to
Yeah.
sociologists.
I am not against quantitative analysis if quantitative analysis gives a contribution, but the problem is on the other side.
And you think it's quantitative who doesn't like?
No.
Okay, no, well, I think that there's merit in both. And I don't think
accept anything that is not generalizable. So
no, in a way,
Yeah.
I feel that you don't get the full picture if you don't look at both. So,
yeah, but there's clearly a bias in the public view on quantitative and qualitative analyses, and that many people think it's more reliable if you have numbers. For example, if you have a quantification, then it's good science, and if it's like participant observation, then people say, yeah, 2 years of participant observation, what does it tell us? You know, and I think no, it tells us a lot. If you for 2 months or 2 years in a certain social group and you get the gist of their social behavior, and that's something that you cannot find when you only look at numbers. Yeah, all this social stratifications and differences and attitudes and what people think about their lives, etc. That's something that is difficult to count because very often you don't get true answers or you get only very vague answers, etc., etc. So, and yeah, that's why all of a sudden certain things happen and nobody knows why Trump is elected or why, you know, I mean, nobody has foreseen that Trump will be president. Yeah, all the quantitative approaches have claimed that it's not possible that this guy will be the president of the United States, and all of a sudden he was. So, yeah, numbers count in public, in the public opinion, but that doesn't mean that it's all wrong to work with numbers. Okay.
Sorry, I'd like to add something to that. Whenever I think, according to my perspective, whenever we're doing quantitative analysis, we're actually trying to prove a point. And when it's qualitative aspect, there are a lot of things that conflict with that certain point that we're trying to prove. So that's why people opt for the quantitative analysis rather than the qualitative, or they mix it up, like the mixed method approach, so that they can actually prove a certain point of their research that they're trying to work on, to make a statement out of what their research is.
Yeah.
So that's why.
But I think,
yeah.
I think it works in both directions. So it's like a control. I mean, if you have only the qualitative analysis, then it might be interesting to control for how often does that happen, or is it a widespread opinion in this community, etc. Okay. So the qualitative analysis prevents, the quantitative analysis prevents you from making too much out of a qualitative finding, and vice versa. So if you have a quantitative finding, and then the qualitative analysis also can say, no, be careful, this is it only appears as a clear picture. It is not a clear picture. Yeah. And if you go into the details, if you go to the subjects, the individuals, then all of a sudden it becomes more complex, and that's also a kind of control, I would say.
Okay.
Okay,
Yeah. I think.
shall we close?
I think so. Yes, because
Okay.
there's going to be another presentation in
Yeah,
15 minutes or so, I think. Yeah.
yeah, that's good.
Okay. So, Bernd, thank you very, very much for this presentation and also for the discussion after that, which was very interesting. I mean, this quantitative, qualitative matter is definitely of interest, I think, to many of the doctoral students as well. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So
Thank you.
thanks a lot. Thanks everybody for coming, and
you.
have a nice continuation.
Yeah.
Yes, we reconvene at 3:45.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.